The flimsy white envelope felt like a brick in my hand. My name was scrawled on it in elegant, looping script, the kind of handwriting you'd expect on a wedding invitation, not a notice of eviction. Behind the envelope, Karen's face was a mask of cold satisfaction. She didn't have to say a word. Her eyes, magnified by her thick-rimmed glasses, spoke volumes. I finally got you. I was a newcomer to the cul-de-sac, a stray dog that had wandered into a kennel of purebreds. The moment I signed my lease, I became a target. Karen, the self-proclaimed president of the HOA, was the master of ceremonies for the neighborhood's silent suburban warfare. My crime? A half-inch of unapproved mulch spilling onto the sidewalk. A lawn that was an acceptable, if not pristine, shade of green. A car that was parked in the street for more than 4 hours on a Tuesday. The infractions were petty, the fines were relentless, and the campaign to make my life miserable had been a symphony of passive-aggressive notes and pointed stares. She was a suburban sniper, picking off nonconformists one by one, her greatest weapon the neighborhood gossip chain. But this was the nuclear option. She handed me the envelope with a gloved hand, as if my very existence was a biohazard. "We've tried to be lenient, but you simply don't understand the rules of this community," she said, her voice a precise, emotionless monotone. "Karen, this is ridiculous." "You know I've fixed everything you've complained about," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Aha, but have you? A review of the bylaws indicates that you've been in violation since the day you moved in. I have pictures. We're a proud community, a family, and we can't have someone who doesn't respect our values. We've decided to terminate your lease. You have 30 days. I took a step back, the world spinning. My apartment, my little fortress against her endless tirade, was now a trap. I had nowhere else to go. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise to unravel my life. I stared at the envelope, my mind racing, but before I could utter another word, a flash of something foreign crossed her face, something that looked almost like grief. The front door of her house, the immaculate white centerpiece of the cul-de-sac, opened slowly. A figure, her brother Mark, stood silhouetted against the dark interior. His face was blotchy and red, his posture slumped. He took a hesitant step outside, looking at Karen with eyes full of a pain so raw it was palpable. "Karen," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, she's gone." The air went still. The breeze stopped rustling the leaves. Karen's face, a second ago a picture of cold, triumphant malice, crumpled. The envelope slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the perfect green grass between us. Her perfect facade shattered, revealing a chasm of sorrow so deep it took my breath away. Her mother, Eleanor Vance, was dead. Eleanor was the soul of this cul-de-sac, the only one who seemed to exist outside of Karen's rigid rule. Eleanor had been a quiet confidant, a kind voice in a sea of hostility. When I first moved in, it was Eleanor who brought me a pie. A real warm, homemade pie, and told me, "Don't you mind, Karen. She means well, but she takes herself too seriously." She had shared stories of the neighborhood's true history, the one before Karen's reign, of potlucks and children's laughter and a genuine sense of community. She was a silent ally, and in her quiet way, she had made me feel less alone. And now she was gone. Karen ran to her brother, collapsing into his arms. He held her, his shoulders shaking. For a moment, she was just a daughter who had lost her mother. Not the HOA president, not my tormentor, just a woman consumed by grief. I stood there, frozen, the eviction notice lying at my feet. The injustice of my own situation felt petty in the face of this monumental loss. The universe had delivered a strange, twisted form of karma. My nemesis, in her moment of cruel triumph, had just lost the one person who mattered most to her. I walked back to my apartment, the white envelope in my hand. The weight of it had changed. It was no longer a symbol of Karen's cruelty, but a memento of the moment her world fell apart. Inside my quiet living room, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about Eleanor. She had always been a bridge, a quiet, unseen force connecting people. With her gone, what would the neighborhood become? The next 2 days were a blur of grief and preparation. I saw cars pulling up to Karen's house, her family and friends arriving. I saw her, a shadow in her own window, a silhouette of a woman who was no longer in control of her world. The eviction notice sat on my kitchen counter, a constant reminder of our last venomous interaction. I told myself I would fight it. I would hire a lawyer, I would find a loophole. I wouldn't let her win. Then, a floral-scented card appeared in my mailbox, a funeral announcement, in loving memory of Eleanor Vance. The service was Saturday morning. My first instinct was to throw it in the trash. Why would I go to the funeral of my enemy's mother, a woman whose death had been used as the backdrop for my own ruin? But something in my gut told me to go. It wasn't about Karen. It was about Eleanor. The morning of the funeral, I put on my one good suit, the one I had worn to my brother's wedding, now a somber uniform. The air was cool and crisp, a pale autumn sun filtering through the trees. The funeral home was a grand stone building I'd passed 100 times. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands tight on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet hum of hushed condolences. The front of the chapel was dominated by a gleaming bronze casket, and next to it stood a large framed portrait of Eleanor, smiling warmly. Her eyes, I noticed, were a softer, kinder version of Karen's. I found a seat in the back, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. I saw the familiar faces of the HOA board members, all dressed in black, their expressions a mix of solemnity and curiosity. They saw me, of course, a few of them whispered. Karen was up front next to her brother, her face a pale, strained mask. She looked fragile, her grief etched into every line of her face. The eulogies began. First, her brother Mark spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Then a few old friends. The words were beautiful, a collage of Eleanor's kindness and wisdom, a story about her tending to a neighbor's garden in the middle of a storm, a memory of her gentle words after a child fell from a bike. These weren't stories of a grand public life, but a quiet, compassionate one. As the final person finished, the officiant, a kind-looking older man, stepped up to the podium. "If anyone else would like to share a memory of Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice soft, "please feel free to come forward." A wave of silence washed over the room. No one moved. The HOA members looked at each other, uncomfortable. Karen glanced around, her eyes hollow. For a moment, she met my gaze. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of grief, defiance, and a sliver of surprise that I was even there. She had her victory. She was getting rid of me. But now it seemed hollow. I felt a sudden, profound shift. My anger at the eviction, my fear, all of it receded. What was left was the memory of a woman who had shown me kindness when no one else would. My feet, without conscious thought, started to move. Karen's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide. She started to mouth something, a silent, desperate no. I ignored her, walking toward the front of the room, every step a deliberate act of defiance. The room went dead silent. The HOA members' whispers died on their lips. I reached the podium, stood behind it, and took a deep breath. I looked out at the faces, then down at Karen. Her eyes were burning with a fury that, for a fleeting moment, overpowered her grief. I didn't have a prepared speech. All I had was the truth, and the truth was a fire, ready to burn it all down. "I didn't know Eleanor Vance for very long," I began, my voice clear and steady. "I'm the guy who lives at 1445 Pineview. Every single person in the room knew exactly who I was." The room held its breath. The silence was a living, breathing thing, heavy with unspoken questions. Karen's face, pale with grief, now burned with a new, furious intensity. The HOA members, a small, polished crowd in their somber suits and dresses, exchanged nervous, sidelong glances. They had come to mourn Eleanor, the gentle matriarch of their neighborhood, not to witness a public spectacle involving me, the outcast. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle on everyone. "I didn't know Eleanor Vance for very long," I repeated, my voice steady. "But in the short time I did, she showed me more kindness than this entire neighborhood combined." I looked directly at Karen. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes narrowed to slits. Her brother Mark, next to her, looked from me to his sister, his expression a mix of confusion and weary sorrow. When I moved into this cul-de-sac, it felt like stepping onto a battlefield, I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room. The rules, the fines, the constant scrutiny, a half-inch of mulch, an unauthorized car on the street. It was all a game, a way to make me feel like I didn't belong. I was treated like an invader, a problem to be solved. The murmuring started. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in the second row, the HOA's vice president, glared at me with undisguised hostility. I ignored him, my focus unwavering. But Eleanor didn't see it that way, I said, my voice softening. The day I moved in, she came to my door. Not with a warning or a list of rules, but with a pie. A real, warm, homemade apple pie. She told me to ignore the rules, that the people here were kind, even if they sometimes forgot how to show it. She was the one who welcomed me, who made me feel like I had a place here. Karen's head snapped up. She stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "How dare you turn my mother's funeral into your personal platform?" "I'm not," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I'm here to honor your mother. I'm here to tell the truth. Eleanor was a good woman, a kind woman. A woman who understood that community isn't about perfectly manicured lawns and endless rules. It's about people. It's about kindness. It's about a warm pie on a cold day and a gentle word when you're feeling alone." A gasp rippled through the room. The HOA members were a study in silent outrage. This was not the decorum they were used to. This was raw, unfiltered truth, and it was slicing through their carefully constructed reality. 2 days ago, I continued, my voice now loud and clear, I received an eviction notice from Karen, an eviction notice for minor infractions that have already been corrected. And she gave it to me on the very same day her mother passed away. A final act of cruelty meant to show me who was in charge. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Mark, Karen's brother, looked at his sister with wide eyes. His grief seemed to momentarily give way to confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. Karen herself was shaking, a furious, silent rage building behind her eyes. "This is a lie!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "You're a parasite, a leech on this community. You want to live by your own rules and you think you can come here and make this about you? I'm here because your mother was the only person who had the courage to tell me the truth. She was the only one who saw me as a person and not an object of a power struggle." I shot back, my heart pounding in my chest. "She was the soul of this place, and with her gone, you've made it a kingdom of spite." Suddenly, Karen lunged for the podium, her grief and fury erupting into a physical torrent. Mark grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Karen, stop!" he pleaded, but she was a woman possessed. She struggled against his grip, her face a contorted mask of rage and humiliation. The polished, controlled HOA president was gone, replaced by a sobbing, furious daughter. "Get out!" she screamed at me. "Get out of here! Get out of our lives!" "And what about you?" I asked, my voice cutting through her sobs. "What about the fact that your mother, the one you're supposed to be mourning, was the only one who stood up for me? Do you think she would have wanted this? Do you think she would have approved of this vendetta?" Karen went still. The air crackled with the raw emotion of the moment. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. The room was watching not just me, but her. Her facade of control had been ripped away, and for the first time, everyone saw the ugly, vindictive core beneath. Just as the officiant was about to intervene, a new voice cut through the tense silence. It was low, firm, and authoritative, coming from the back of the chapel. I believe I can shed some light on that. Everyone turned. A woman in a perfectly tailored gray suit was standing in the last row. She was older, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. She held a black leather briefcase. She wasn't one of the neighbors. She was a stranger. She walked slowly, deliberately down the aisle, her heels making a soft click on the marble floor. She didn't look at Karen. She looked at me, and she smiled. A small, knowing smile that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She stopped next to the casket and unclasped her briefcase. "My name is Evelyn Cross. I was Eleanor Vance's attorney, and I am here to fulfill her last wishes." She pulled a crisp, legal-looking document from the briefcase. It seems Eleanor was well aware of the ongoing conflicts in this neighborhood, particularly the management style of her daughter. In her final days, she grew deeply concerned about a young man she had come to call her friend. A young man who, despite her daughter's best efforts, maintained his integrity and his dignity. A young man who was facing an unjust eviction. The room went completely silent. Karen's face was white. Eleanor Vance's final instructions to me were quite clear, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. She instructed me to be present at her funeral. And should the matter of this eviction still be a topic of discussion, I was to hand this document to the person she intended to protect. This person, Mr. Pineview, is you. She extended the document toward me. My hand was shaking as I took it. It was an official-looking deed, stamped and signed. I read the title, my breath catching in my throat. Deed of Gift, Lot 1445, Pineview Cul-de-sac. I looked up at her, my mind reeling. I looked down at the paper, then back at Karen. Karen, who was now staring at her mother's lawyer in silent horror. A realization dawning in her eyes more terrible than anything I could have ever said. "This is my property," I whispered. Evelyn nodded, her smile widening. "It has been for the past 3 weeks. Eleanor transferred ownership of this property to you so you could never be evicted again." The silence that followed Evelyn Cross's words was more deafening than any scream. It was the absolute, crushing stillness of a world turned upside down. The HOA members, moments ago a unified front of polite disapproval, were now a scattered collection of shocked faces. They looked at the deed in my hand, then at Karen, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the impossible reality of the moment. The very foundation of their power structure, the sanctity of their rules and property ownership, had been upended by the quiet kindness of a woman they had supposedly come to mourn. Karen's face was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated horror. The furious mask she had worn for the past few days, a fusion of rage and grief, cracked and shattered. She took a stumbling step back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the deed as if it were a venomous snake. The betrayal wasn't from me. It was from the person she had just eulogized. Her mother had seen her, truly seen her, and had chosen to take away the very power Karen had used to control everyone. "This is a lie," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. "This is not real. It's not legal. You can't do this." Evelyn, the lawyer, remained perfectly composed. She gestured to the officiant, who was standing frozen at the podium, a bewildered look on his face. "With your permission, Reverend, this matter is a private one, but it is of utmost importance to Eleanor's final wishes." The officiant, too stunned to object, simply nodded, ceding the floor. Evelyn turned back to the room, her gaze resting on the rest of the HOA. Eleanor was a woman of foresight. She knew that her final days would be fraught with conflict. She was aware of the aggressive nature of the HOA's campaign against this young man. She paused, her eyes lingering on the HOA president, a subtle, cold judgment in her stare. She saw her daughter's vendetta for what it was, not a pursuit of community standards, but an exercise in personal cruelty. The eviction notice was the final straw. Eleanor, knowing her time was short, acted to protect a man who had shown her kindness and who was suffering an injustice at the hands of her own family. The room buzzed with a low hum of disbelief. The whispers were no longer of outrage, but of scandal. The HOA's reign was not just threatened. It was exposed. Their carefully cultivated image of a pristine, moral community was revealed to be nothing more than a front for Karen's petty tyranny. "Mark," Karen's brother finally spoke, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and dawning horror. "Karen, is this true? The eviction notice? You didn't tell me." Karen looked at him, her brother, the one person who should have been on her side. Her eyes were full of a wounded rage. He deserved it. He broke the rules. He had to be taught a lesson. "A lesson?" I cut in, my voice low and dangerous. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "What lesson? That if you don't conform, you get driven out? That's not a lesson, Karen. That's a dictatorship." I held up the deed. "Your mother's last lesson was to you. She taught you that kindness is more powerful than cruelty, and that real power comes not from control, but from character. She chose to give her house to a stranger rather than see you destroy his life. That was it, the final blow. The last remnant of Karen's composure evaporated. A guttural sob escaped her and she ran. Not to her brother, not to a friend, but out of the chapel entirely, a broken figure fleeing the scene of her public humiliation. Mark, after a moment of stunned silence, hurried after her, his face a mask of shame and grief. Evelyn Cross watched them go, her expression unreadable. She then turned to the remaining HOA members, her voice cutting and clear. "My services here are concluded. I'll be in touch with the board regarding the change in ownership of this property." Eleanor made a point of noting that there were to be no further attempts at harassment. "Any such attempt will be met with the full force of her will. A will which, as you have seen, has a long reach." She turned to me, her smile returning. It was a genuine, warm smile this time. "Eleanor always knew how to make a statement," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She told me, just wait until the funeral. The look on her face will be priceless." She had a wicked sense of humor. With that, she gave a final nod and strode out of the chapel, leaving me standing alone, holding a piece of paper that had changed everything. The remaining people were a flurry of movement and averted eyes. The funeral service had effectively ended, not with a eulogy, but with a public execution of power. The HOA members, their authority shattered, quickly filed out, their heads bowed, unable to meet my gaze. They had come to bury Eleanor, and instead, they had witnessed the burial of their own dominance. I was the last one in the chapel, standing amidst the fading scent of lilies and the remnants of a family's grief and a community's undoing. I held the deed in my hand. It was no longer a symbol of injustice, but of quiet, profound justice. Eleanor, a woman who had passed from this world, had reached back and, with one simple act, had corrected a great wrong. She hadn't sought revenge. She had simply ensured that her last act was one of kindness, one that would ripple through the lives of everyone in the cul-de-sac. I looked at the smiling portrait of Eleanor, her eyes twinkling with a secret knowledge, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The war was far from over. Karen was still out there, humiliated and enraged. But the terms of engagement had changed. I wasn't fighting for my right to stay anymore. I was fighting for my right to be a neighbor. And for the first time, I felt like I had a fighting chance. The silence I had left behind in the chapel followed me out into the crisp autumn air. The funeral home's parking lot, a place meant for quiet commiseration, felt like the final stage of a dramatic play. I walked slowly, the deed held loosely in my hand, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the heavy floral scent that still clung to my clothes. The world was spinning, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other feeling monumental. I was no longer an unwanted tenant. I was a homeowner, a victor in a war I hadn't even known I was fighting. As I approached my car, I saw them. Karen and her brother, Mark, were standing by her immaculate white SUV. She was a hurricane of rage, her arms flailing, her voice a low, furious hiss that carried on the cool breeze. Mark stood there, a defeated soldier, his shoulders slumped as he absorbed her verbal onslaught. "You let him do that, Mark?" she screamed, her face contorted. "You just stood there and let him humiliate me. In front of everyone! In front of Mom's friends. What was I supposed to do, Karen?" Mark pleaded, his voice thin with exhaustion. "You were out of control." And what he said, the eviction notice. "You gave it to him that day? On the day Mom died? How could you?" "He deserved it." "He's a menace. He's a stain on this community." "No, Karen, you are," Mark shot back, his voice finally gaining some strength. "You're the one who turned a kind, decent man into a public spectacle. This isn't about the HOA anymore. This is about you and your petty, vindictive little games. Mom saw it. We all see it now." Karen recoiled as if struck. The fight visibly drained out of her, replaced by a deep, profound hurt. For a moment, she looked like a little girl whose most cherished secret had been exposed to the world. Then, her grief and fury coalesced into something new, something colder and more dangerous. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, found mine across the parking lot. A spark ignited in their depths, not of shame or defeat, but of pure, unadulterated hatred. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a full-scale war. I didn't break eye contact. I got into my car, the deed resting on the passenger seat like a priceless artifact. The drive home was a blur. My mind reeled with the events of the last hour. Evelyn Cross, Eleanor, the deed. The truth was almost too surreal to comprehend. I was no longer living in a rental. I was living in my house gifted to me by a woman who had, in her last act, chosen kindness over blood. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. The beige siding, the meticulously trimmed hedges, the perfect-sized porch. It was all mine. The eviction notice was still on the kitchen counter where I had left it. I picked it up, feeling a strange sense of detachment. It was an empty threat, a worthless piece of paper. I tore it in half, then into smaller pieces and dropped them into the trash can. A small but profoundly satisfying act. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, walking through the rooms, touching the walls, looking out the windows. I found myself looking for signs of Eleanor. A faded stain on the carpet, a chipped corner of the kitchen counter. Traces of a life that had ended, but whose final ripple had just begun to reshape my own. The quiet victory was short-lived. The next morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a delegation of the HOA board standing on my porch. The vice president, a man named Bob Jenkins, with a perpetually worried expression, stepped forward. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clipped and nervous. Privately, I invited them in, leading them to the living room. They sat on the edges of my couch, looking as uncomfortable as guests at a funeral. "We wanted to apologize for Karen's behavior," Bob began. "It was uncalled for. We had no idea she had served you an eviction notice. She didn't consult the board. It was entirely her decision." "And the deed?" I asked, looking from face to face. "What about the deed? We don't know what to make of it," another member, a woman named Carol, stammered. "It seems unorthodox." "Unorthodox, but legal," I said, a smile playing on my lips. Eleanor's lawyer was very clear on that. The tension in the room was thick. They weren't there to apologize. They were there to feel me out, to see if they could regain control of the narrative, to figure out how to navigate the new landscape that Eleanor had created. "Karen has been suspended," Bob said carefully. "Temporarily, of course. Until we can resolve things." "Resolve what? The fact that I own this house?" I asked, my voice taking on a harder edge. "Or the fact that your HOA, led by a vindictive tyrant, was just exposed as a sham?" Bob's face reddened. "We are a fair and just organization. We have rules. We have bylaws that must be followed." "Then follow them. The rules now state that I, as a property owner, am a member of this community. And as a member, I have rights. So let me be very clear. If I receive so much as a single anonymous note about my lawn, or a passive-aggressive text about my car, I will take it as a personal threat, and I will be back in that chapel, this time with the media, to expose every single one of you." They sat in stunned silence. I wasn't the intimidated tenant anymore. I was a homeowner, a member of their club, and I had just used their own rules and their own fear against them. They quickly made their excuses and left. I closed the door, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. The small victory felt hollow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The real fight came that afternoon. The doorbell rang again, but this time there were no delegates. Just Karen. She stood on my porch, her face devoid of any emotion, a silent, menacing statue. She wasn't sobbing anymore. She was hardened. "You think you won," she said, her voice low and even, a chilling contrast to her outburst in the chapel. I didn't think it. "Karen, I know it." She took a step closer, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "You're holding a meaningless piece of paper. You think my mother, a woman who had a failing memory, was in her right mind to sign away her house to a stranger she knew for less than a month?" My heart sank. This was her countermove. It wasn't about the HOA anymore. It was about invalidating the deed itself. "Eleanor was of sound mind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her lawyer said so. "She was a woman of foresight. She was a woman who was sick and confused and easily manipulated," Karen hissed, a vicious smile creeping onto her lips. "I have a team of lawyers, and they're going to prove that. They're going to get that deed annulled, and they're going to put you on the street for the emotional distress you caused me and my family during our time of grief. You didn't just win, Mr. Pineview. You just started a very expensive war, and I promise you I will burn this neighborhood to the ground before I let you stay in my mother's house." She turned and walked back to her car, a dark, venomous silhouette against the setting sun. I stood on my porch, the cold air hitting my face, my brief moment of triumph shattered. She wasn't fighting with rules anymore. She was fighting with vengeance. And she was right. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cold air that rushed past me felt less like a physical chill, and more like the icy truth of Karen's words. I will burn this neighborhood to the ground before I let you stay in my mother's house. Her promise wasn't an idle threat. It was a declaration of war, a dark vow that revealed the true depth of her rage. I stood on the porch long after her car had disappeared, the setting sun painting the sky in a bruised purple and orange. My victory at the funeral felt hollow now, a fragile illusion in the face of a legal assault that could strip everything away. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about vindication, about proving that a person's kindness could not be undone by another's cruelty. The next morning, I called Evelyn Cross. Her voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, and entirely unsurprised. I was expecting your call, she said. Karen filed for a temporary injunction to halt the transfer of the deed this morning. Her lawyers are alleging undue influence and mental incapacitation on Eleanor's part. It's a standard if desperate move. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Do we have a defense? Evelyn chuckled, a dry, confident sound. Mr. Pineview, you seem to have underestimated Eleanor. She was a woman who didn't just plan for the present. She prepared for the future. She knew her daughter, and she anticipated exactly this. We will not be on the defensive. We will be on the offensive. She told me to meet her at her office the next day. The place was a quiet sanctuary of mahogany and leather, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the past few days. She ushered me into her conference room, and for the next several hours, she laid out the intricate web of precautions Eleanor had taken. Eleanor didn't just sign the deed, Evelyn explained, placing a stack of documents on the table. She had a series of consultations with a third-party geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in assessing mental capacity. She underwent rigorous cognitive evaluations. The results are here, notarized and stamped, all proving she was of sound mind, clear of any confusion, and fully aware of the consequences of her actions. I stared at the papers in disbelief. She went through all this for me? For you and for a principle she believed in, Evelyn replied. She was deeply troubled by Karen's behavior. The HOA was one thing, but the eviction notice, she saw it for what it was, a final act of control, a repudiation of the kindness she had tried to show you. So she took steps to ensure that her last act was one of absolute, unassailable justice. She then pulled a small, sealed USB drive from a locked compartment in her briefcase. This is the final piece of the puzzle. Eleanor recorded a video with me, detailing her wishes, her rationale, and her absolute conviction in the matter. She wanted it to be seen only if Karen chose to challenge the deed. She said she wanted to give her one last chance to do the right thing. The finality of it was staggering. Eleanor had set a trap, a final, heartbreaking challenge for her daughter. The next week, we were in a small, sterile conference room for a pre-trial mediation. The air was thick with the scent of sterile cleaner and unspoken animosity. Karen was there, flanked by two expensive lawyers who looked like they'd just stepped out of a high-end catalog. Her face was a mask of cold fury and determination. Mark was not with her. She had chosen her lawyers over her family, her vengeance over her grief. This is a clear-cut case of elder abuse and undue influence. Karen's lead lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Finch, said, her voice a clipped, practiced monotone. Our client, in her time of profound grief, is being victimized by a tenant who manipulated a dying old woman. We have statements from multiple neighbors detailing the plaintiff's manipulative history. The transfer is invalid, and we will not rest until this sham deed is nullified. Karen stared straight ahead, a picture of wounded dignity, but I could see the tremor in her hands. She was putting on a performance, but the fear was real. Evelyn, my lawyer, smiled. It was the same small, knowing smile she had given me at the funeral. I understand your position, Ms. Finch. It's a compelling narrative, but it lacks a crucial element: evidence. Mr. Pineview did not manipulate Eleanor. He was a kind neighbor. He was a friend. Eleanor's actions were born of her own free will, documented meticulously, and legally binding. Evelyn laid out our defense, point by point. The psychiatric evaluations, the notarized signatures, the detailed logs of Eleanor's clear conversations. Each piece of paper was a hammer blow to Karen's flimsy case. I watched the confidence drain from Karen's face, her carefully constructed mask beginning to crack. "We will not concede," Ms. Finch said, her voice a little less certain now. "We will take this to court. The public will see the truth, will they?" Evelyn asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She looked at the mediator, then at Karen's legal team. "We're prepared to present a final piece of evidence, a video testimony from Eleanor Vance herself. We believe it will definitively resolve any lingering doubts about her mental state and the reasons for her decision." The words hung in the air. Karen's eyes widened, a flicker of raw terror in their depths. She knew what this meant. She knew her mother had found a way to speak from beyond the grave. "We would like to view this evidence," Ms. Finch said, trying to regain control. Her voice, however, was laced with a hint of dread. Evelyn took out the USB drive and inserted it into a nearby monitor. The screen flickered to life. There was Eleanor sitting in a plush armchair, the sunlight streaming through a window behind her, her face aglow with a gentle peace. "If you are watching this, it means my daughter, Karen, has chosen to challenge my wishes," Eleanor's voice said, clear as a bell. Her gaze was not on the camera but seemed to look directly at Karen. "I am of sound mind. This is my will. I am choosing to give my house to my friend, not for spite, but out of love for a man who reminded me that kindness is the most valuable currency we have." Then, her face softened, and she spoke directly to Karen. "My darling, I love you, but I am heartbroken by what you have become. You have let power consume you. You have chosen rules over people, and in doing so, you have broken this community. My last wish for you is that you find your way back to the heart you once had, the heart that was not afraid to be kind, the heart that was like mine." The video ended. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the same silence from the chapel, but magnified by the cold reality of the legal setting. Karen's lawyers were exchanging horrified looks. There was no defense against this. No claim of mental incapacity could stand against the clear, heartfelt testimony of a woman who had planned every single detail of her final act. Karen's face, so full of fury moments ago, crumpled. Her shoulders shook, and a single silent tear rolled down her cheek. She wasn't just losing the house. She was losing the last shred of her dignity, of her power, of her mother's love. She had believed her mother's affection was unconditional, and her ultimate act had shown it was anything but. Ms. Finch stood up, her face a mask of defeat. "The case is dismissed. The terms of the deed are valid." Karen didn't protest. She just sat there, a broken woman, her grief finally eclipsing her rage. The battle was over. The house was mine. The community, the HOA, the deed, all of it paled in comparison to the quiet justice that had been served in that room. Eleanor, a woman who lived with a simple, powerful grace, had not only saved me, but had delivered a final, devastating lesson to the one person who needed it most. I looked at the now empty chair where Karen had been sitting, and I finally understood what Eleanor had meant when she gave me that first pie. It wasn't just a welcome, it was a promise. A promise that in her neighborhood, kindness would always win.